Okay, well, this session is called The Way Ahead, Impediments and Opportunities. And I'm going to hand over to Guillermo in a moment, but I would like to say this. We had a very rich conversation this morning, but it's clear that on the one hand there's an urgent need for action, and we need a proper plan that emerges from here. But on the other hand, people are all already working in their own arenas, and there's a sort of cellular structure, which is a healthy thing. But at the same time, we need systemic change, and systemic change needs more than the sum of the parts. So we're going to come to that in the concluding session, but I think this is it's very appropriate that we punctuate this discussion with what follows. So over to you, Guillermo, and I hope that we can find some inspiration from what our very eminent speakers are going to offer us. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to take it as a very personal failure if out of this panel I don't get something interesting. You all know these three characters. I'm very honored to be chairing this panel. My name again is Guillermo Castilleja. I work with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation in Palo Alto. And this afternoon, we have three panelists who are going to help us chart the way forward based on their insights and hopefully building on what we have been discussing yesterday and today. First, to my left, we have Lord Nicholas Stern. He's a professor of economics and government at the London School of Economics. He's also the chair of the Grantham Research Institute. Lord Stern was an advisor to the UK government on the economics of climate change and development from 2005 and 2007. He was the head of the Stern Review on the economics of climate change published in 2006. And I gather that most of you know about this report. One of the main reasons why we were interested in having Lord Stern with us this afternoon is because we want to hear his perspectives about how a report of this nature, of this caliber, influence policy. I mean, how do you go from analysis to action? Peter Seligman is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Conservation International. Peter is guiding his organization on a vision of environmentally healthy world that will provide economic opportunities and security for all people. My foundation is very proud to be associated with Conservation International throughout the last 12 years. And I have to say that this transition that CI has been undergoing over the last 2 years now is one of the most significant ones, where a lot of the more traditional approaches to conservation are being gradually replaced by a much more human-centric notion of conservation. And then at the end of the round is Sam Dryden. Sam is one of the people who knows the most about agriculture and food systems. He works he's a senior fellow and former director of agricultural development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he has been overseeing efforts to help millions of the world's poorest farming families boost their productivity. And most of his work in that context has been in Africa. Sam has worked in a number of countries, served on a number of boards and committees, including the Executive Council of CGIAR, where he has been involved in efforts to advance food security in Africa. So we basically have a very credible panel, if you will, in the context of many of the issues that we have been discussing today. And I would like to do the following. I would like them to address some specific issues for 5-10 minutes. I'm going to be asking them a few questions, and then we will open it up for comments and questions from the audience. Okay? Let's start then with Lord Stern. One of the things that we have been discussing today is the need of having some kind of report or assessment that would help us integrate many of the different elements of the food system in a way that would allow us to identify what are the main externalities and how to deal with those externalities as some kind of a blueprint or guidance for decision making on economic policy. We had a debate here about what that means and whether it's wise to embark in something of that magnitude. But of course, when we think about this type of report, the first thing that we think about is the Stern report. And so one of the things that we would love to hear from you is what kind of advice do you have for us? I mean, is this something that we should do? What are some of the red flags that you think we should be aware of? I think it would be very useful for us to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Two pieces of advice on a report, and I had some thoughts about what the report should contain. Two pieces of advice on the report: make it less than 700 pages, and make sure it's addressed to the economic decision makers in the world. Environment people are nice and cuddly, and some of our best friends, but they don't take the big decisions. And we have to be really convincing, good, sound in arguments, and we believe that the arguments are there and they're sound, but they have to be expressed in a way that those people who run big firms and take big decisions, and those people who manage finance ministries or prime ministers or presidents, that they can see the arguments. And I'd just say those two things. But of course, a report has to have a good storyline. And it has to have a storyline that people can take away. And even though we had 700 pages in the Stern Review, a few things we emphasized which did seem to be remembered was that the costs of inaction are far bigger than the costs of action. And this is the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. And both those things are at the heart of what we did. And I really am embarrassed about 700 pages. But you have to have a coherent storyline in such a report. Here's the three things that I was asked to think about the way forward. What's the title of the session, right? So I thought three things have to be very strong in the report. The first thing is that this is very big in the whole story of climate change and conservation. You can do the sums this way and that way, but if you include most of the things that are fairly obvious you should include about not only producing food and what happens in that process, getting it to the market and so on, and using it, you get to numbers around 30% or so of greenhouse gas emissions. To be honest, I don't think it matters whether it's 25% or 35%, and it'd be a bad way to spend your time arguing about exactly what that was. The point is it's big. It's a big part of the story, and you can't expect to cut emissions down from 50 billion tons CO2 equivalent a year now down to below 20 is what we have to do within 40 years, unless you take on the really big things. And this is one of the really big things. It's not only big, it's integrated with the whole development story, because the two defining challenges of this century are managing climate change and overcoming world poverty. And if we fail on one, we fail on the other. And 75, again, the precise number doesn't matter very much, but probably 75% of the world's poorest people are in rural areas. And people in rural areas depend in a major way on agriculture for their income. They depend on other things for their income too, but they depend in a major way on agriculture for their income. So if you want to think about managing climate change and the environment much more generally than that, and if you want to think about overcoming world poverty, so in other words, if you want to think about the two defining challenges of our century, you have to place agriculture at centre stage and food systems at centre stage. So that's the first message. It's big, and it's about much more than environment. Well, that's enough for most of us, but it's about much more than the environment. It's about fighting poverty. And that's the first part of the story. Adaptation, mitigation, development, inextricably wound up together. And any attempts to pull them apart, this bit's adaptation, this bit's mitigation, this bit's development, which you see a lot, actually, including in Warsaw, where I, probably with a number of others, just come back from the UNFCCC. Attempts to pull it apart are diversionary and problematic. And just take one example. I mean, SRI rice, the system of rice intensification, where you don't flood the fields like you do in standard things, so you don't have the release of methane from the flooded fields to the same extent. You are more robust to weather difficulties, and of course, you save on water and energy. So that is mitigation, reduced emissions, adaptation, stronger position, more resilient against difficult weather conditions, and it's development, because you've saved a lot of energy and water, and actually you've bumped up your rice yields as well. So that's an example, a very strong, clear, important example. But there are many more on the way in which these things are bound together. So it's big and they're bound together. Secondly is waste. Now, I'm sure I haven't been, this is the first bit I've been to, but you must have been discussing waste all the time. But it's huge. You've got to go for the big ones. This is huge. I mean, we know that in developing countries, because of poor infrastructure, poor storage, and so on, there's a tremendous amount of waste before the food is actually getting to markets and being consumed. And we know in rich countries there's a tremendous amount of waste after the food has got to the outlets. Now, you've got both kinds of waste in both countries, but you can emphasize one in one and one in the other, but both of these occur in both. But the policies you'd need to attack that waste are different according to if it's lost on the way to the market and if it's lost after it's gone through supermarkets and so on. But we can understand on the whole what to do about both these things. So if you want to increase effective food availability, you've got 30, 40%, whatever is right there. And we know what to do. And you've got to find things which with pushback is a bit difficult. Well, hands up, everybody's in favour of waste, you know. This is something which you really can persuade people is obviously daft, and there are obviously a lot of things you can do about it. Now, in rich countries, it's a bit more behavioural, regulatory, not stuffing people with two for one each time they walk through the door. And of course, saying to people that it might be a good idea to eat less. But people can understand how big that problem is. You've got another 30, 40, 50% you can persuade people, this is big stuff, and we can understand what to do. Now, the third thing in the storyline is all those distortions, externalities, market failures out there. I mean, people really can, in many places, pull water out of streams, pull water out of water tables for nothing. And they can pour all sorts of nasty things into water, often fertilizer, pesticide connected, but other things too, they can do it for nothing. I mean, I've been working in one village in Moradabad district, some of you know this very well, but I've been working in one village for 40 years now in northern India, watching that village change, how their incomes change. About 10 years ago, a paper mill about 3 miles away, and they just pumped this muck into the river for nothing. And we can see and recognize all these market failures. I won't rehearse them all because you must have spent most of your time rehearsing. But again, I think people can understand that and people can relate to that. One way, of course, of identifying just how big these are and where the biggest ones are is the true cost accounting. The reason that you do it in the first pass is to try to find out where the biggest problems are. There's some of them are obvious, but they're not all completely obvious. Their relative magnitude that's not something that's necessarily completely obvious. So that's one reason why you do true cost accounting. And point out through those kinds of methods where the problems are. I mean, in my own case, when I was chief economist of the World Bank, I gave a speech where I said that the common agricultural policy, I mean, I did it in a European accent, of course, but I said although I made it, in Washington, that the common agricultural policy was politically antiquated because you were buying off a tiny fraction of the population, where 40 years ago that wasn't a tiny, but it's politically antiquated, economically illiterate. If you want to support people, there are much better ways of doing it than that, and environmentally destructive. But apart from that, it was all right. And I got the denunciatory letters from 2 commissioners to the president of the World Bank. But you have to take on those kinds of things and describe the problems in a language that people can understand. And true cost accounting is to help you do that, identify how big the problems are and where you can intervene. Now, I won't rehearse because it's ground you've covered already. But those 3 areas, why it's so important quantitatively, and at the same time why it's integrated with fighting poverty. Secondly, waste. And third, identifying those market failures and pointing out in language that people can understand and using numbers that people can understand where it's going wrong and what you can do. If you do that, it seems to me you can also tell a cheerful story about increasing food availability, techniques of production like SRI that are going to give greater productivity and help poor people with incomes and so on. So not just knocking, but you can translate those stories into a much better way of doing things. Much more productive agriculture, much less pernicious agriculture, and much greater incomes for poorer people. So that's the kind of storyline, it seems to me. Now, I gave it with 3 moderately simple blocks, but I think most people could have understood that. They might go a bit bleary-eyed when you go on about true cost accounting, but pouring muck into waste, they understand. Pouring muck into rivers, they understand. So I think it's possible to get those 3 messages across.
And those messages, do you think are best conveyed at a global scale, or they need to be locally relevant in order for the messages to be converted into action?
Well, both. I mean, most politics is local, as they say, and I think people would understand the waste in their own supermarkets in the UK probably a bit better than stored grain going mouldy and eaten by rats in India. But if you're in India, you'd know all about stored grain going mouldy and being eaten by rats, although you may not patronize supermarkets and be tempted by 2-for-1 offers. So I think it has to be local, but it seems to me that those who are involved in trying to support development and manage climate change around the world should be supportive of what's happening in other places too.
Thank you. We're going to come back to some of these issues. Pete, one of the questions that keep on coming back, at least in my own mind, about this discussion on food systems, coming from where we come from, which is conservation. The question is, what is it that, when we consider food systems, we need to know about ecosystems that would allow us to think about sustainability in a more meaningful way? And conversely, if we get sustainability of the food system right, are we protecting biodiversity as well?
Thank you, Guillermo. So, the way I would answer both of those questions is kind of acknowledging where I personally came from, which was really from the perspective of we've got to take care of nature, and it was a biodiversity bent, which actually was the original relationship we had with the Moore Foundation. And it was, for years, that's what I thought about, and it was really from that perspective of not thinking about food and not thinking about the human side, but thinking about the nature side. it was 5 years ago or so, maybe it was 3 years, it all seems to be a blur, that I thought it's not about nature actually, it's actually about people. And it was a recognition that no matter how we despoil nature, nature is going to survive us. The question is going to be, are we going to be there or not there? And actually this was a human story, and the question was, is humanity going to come through this? And I started thinking about conversations with ministers of environment, whom I've always loved, but I've never seen have any influence. And started thinking about conversations with political leaders about protecting biodiversity, and hearing time and time again, love to focus on that, but actually monkeys don't vote. It was recognizing that putting things into the conservation pantry was useless when the house was burning down. And it was that really is what stimulated us to actually step back and think, what has to change? And what had to change was really thinking about the relevance of ecosystems to human well-being. And frankly, if nature was not needed for human well-being, there wasn't even a chance that it was going to be secured. So we felt we had to really look at the arguments and try to understand if they were real. And I think it's really important that when we talk about true cost accounting, we have to make certain that we actually know that what we're talking about is not just kind of a religious fervor, but actually is real. Because we've got to go from the 15% or so that are supportive of our ideas to more than 50% if we're going to actually have the breakthroughs that we need. So we began an analysis that I think is really central to this conversation, and that is what services does nature provide, and how do you secure those services? And that takes a real thoughtful assessment of science, of understanding ecosystems, understanding what they provide and why nature is essential for human well-being. So if you begin to think through that and you think about pollinators and water and protein and soil and all the aspects of production of food that are supplied by natural systems, it becomes very obvious that you cannot have sustainable production of food if you have not stewarded effectively the ecosystems that supply you with those externalities. The same thing applies to the thinking about health. I mean, it's all interdependent, and unfortunately, over the course of the urbanization of societies and the industrialization of agriculture, we've lost sight of that. So fortunately, we have some good friends, and you, one, the Moore Foundation, helped us a great deal as we thought through this transition and allowed us to make this transformation, which I have to say was very difficult. Probably 25% of the people working for CI left because they actually didn't believe that that was the right thing to do. And then we also had another friend in Sam at the Gates Foundation, and we began to look particularly at smallholder farmers. And what we agreed to in our conversation with the Gates Foundation was that that 1 acre farmer that was trying to produce a livelihood and cash needed more than just seeds, farming technology, and access to market. It needed an input of good soils, good pollinators, water, et cetera. And that was a conversation we began to have with the Gates Foundation in saying, if you're going to have sustainable production, we have to make certain that those externalities are internalized and they're actually secured. Otherwise, we can make a massive investment in agricultural development and food production, and it's going to be a waste because we're going to lose. And that was our argument. Sam agreed. We began to work on this concept of how do you measure the contributions that nature provides for food production? And what are they, and how can they be measured? And how do you get the information from the people that are actually farming, from smallholder farmers? And that was kind of the process we went through. So our institution, our organization, is very much devoted and entirely focused on generating kind of three things. Number one is we want to make certain that we understand what healthy ecosystems provide. It's called natural capital, but what do those reservoirs of natural capital provide for the well-being of society? And we measure that by the health of the system, the outputs or the flows, and do they reach people? That's number one. Number two, we really focus on, and we think we all have to focus on production. We need in societies, and every nation needs it, every community needs it, we need jobs, we need food, we need energy, we need minerals. How do you make sure that that production is done in a sustainable way? How do you produce without undercutting the stability of these reservoirs of natural capital? And thirdly, there's the governance aspect. You have to have a framework. I mean, government plays a very important role, and someone said that earlier today. It's easy to just say the market's going to take care of it. The market won't just take care of it. The market's an essential force for mobilizing capital. But there does need to be a framework of governance that encourages the right behavior. So it's the incentives, it's the policies, it's the laws, it's the enforcement, it's the disincentives. And so that's the way we see this coming together. And so the question of whether we think that biodiversity is essential for food production is answered simply with a resounding yes, absolutely yes. The next question of whether you can actually produce enough food and at the same time maintain biodiversity and ecological health is, if you cannot, we will not have sustainable societies. So the challenge is for us to figure out how to do that. And the really good news, the best news, is an old adage that necessity is the mother of invention. We have a necessity to produce food sustainably. We're going to have to figure out how we get it done, which is why these conversations are really important and why it's essential to have, whether it's the true cost or the true value accounting. This is the only way to do it, because if we do not, if we don't begin to recognize the contributions that ecosystems play for the well-being of societies, and if we don't put a value on that, we will no longer have those ecosystems.
Combining the 2 points that we just heard now, Sam, what do you think when you hear that we're going to be working towards dealing with the externalities and figuring a way of internalizing the externalities? What would that do to food prices, and how would it make it easier or more difficult to reach the goals of alleviating poverty and providing affordable food for the world?
Well, thank you. To pick up on a point that Peter was just making, is that I don't think it's a matter of producing enough food to feed 9 million people. We can do that. The question is, can we do it in a sustainable manner? Can we do it in a manner that we're going to be able to do it for long enough? And what are the pinch points? We think that most of the food systems in the world are not sustainable. I mean, if you look at the United States system, I mean, it's a system largely around corn and more recently soybeans. And it's a demonstration that agriculture is not a natural system. I mean, plants aren't made to plant in rows, fence row to fence row. But politics and natural systems come together in that countries will go towards crops that work for them. And so In the United States, the corn is number 2 yellow corn is king, and whether it's corn flakes or corn syrup, African corn syrup, or whether it's a part of a processed food or not, most of the systems around corn, and that's not sustainable, and it's not sustainable because corn actually takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of fertilizer, takes a lot of pesticides, and to produce that amount of food, whether it's for domestic consumption or export, we're not going to be able to do that for very long. I mean, the aquifers are giving out. We've got dead zones in the water. I mean, we focus at the Gates Foundation on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of northern India and Bangladesh. And I often say that it's actually an easier place to focus than if we're focused on the US or on Western Europe in terms of food systems, because Africa doesn't have the investment in infrastructure that the United States does. It hasn't taken on a model that has all the railroad tracks running to Battle Creek or to wherever it is that there's a global scale manufacturing facility. And so Africa actually has the opportunity to consider what it wants in terms of a food system. And we were just at a convening last week that Kofi Annan had of several, 3 dozen African leaders to talk about their food system. And it was obvious that a new narrative or a new storyline was not only needed, it was imperative because of the changes in the world. And it was a one-day meeting, and we were dedicated to actually having some end result to it that was tangible. And we realized that for us to have a new narrative was the most tangible thing that we could come out with that was important. Because to have the storyline, to understand what the system should be, what it should focus on was critical. For Africans to understand what crops they want to be growing is critical. And our point of view comes from the smallholder farmer, but also from the consumer. So if they want to be eating sorghum, growing millet, something that's more drought resistant, something they like to eat, then the system needs to be geared towards that. Now, we're also focused on nutrition. And so for us, it's a fortuitous moment in time that in the system, when we look at the different crops that are grown, we have the big commodities, we have corn and rice and wheat, but we're also working hard on these other crops that people want to grow and eat, whether it's cassava or millet or sorghum or yams. And we're at a point in time when we can actually find a point of disintermediation that makes a difference because the genomes are being mapped. And it was historically the domain of the multinational corporations to try to patent these genomes. But the Chinese have started have started mapping the genomes themselves and putting it out in the public domain. So we're in an era of massive amounts of data on the genome being put out in public. And it lets us now start to work on these underdeveloped crops like sorghum and millet and so forth. So it makes it viable to actually work on different crops. Well, as we've talked about before, you have to take a system view. So if you're going to have sorghum and millet on this end, you've got to have it on the other end as well, on the end where the manufacturing process and so forth comes in. And so all along, whether it's at the genomic level or the breeding level or the sales level, input level, or whether it's what people have started calling the missing middle. The missing middle is this thing that Nick was talking about, which is that we forget about all of the grain storage and all of the truckers that have to move the grain and all the little processors and all that actually make it such that in the end it gets processed or it gets to market. And to actually work on different crops is going to be important. And to be able to go into these genomes and get the traits out that are important, the nutritional traits. You know, nutritional traits are not easy to track. They're invisible. But now we've actually been able to actually start to identify these nutritional traits. And how do we do that? We actually do it by interacting with indigenous people that actually understand those crops better than we do. And they can help identify them, and we can find them on the genome and map them, and then trace them all the way through breeding. So there is a silver lining to this, and then move them through the system. One of the things that's interesting to us about this exercise of total cost accounting is what is it you're wanting to count? Historically, we've counted, biomass per hectare. And that was the mantra. How many bushels per hectare do you get of corn or soybeans? And that's old thinking. Again, that's part of an old narrative. It's really a question of how many bushels per hectare do you get of water, or how many bushels per hectare of nutrients do you get? I mean, people confuse soil health with fertilizer. And in fact, soil health is very different than fertilizer. Fertilizer sort of tops it off and puts it in the grain. But you have to have good soil to actually begin with. And so, again, how do you measure the soil health? What is it you're wanting to count? And then how do you count it? So for us, we're interested in what is it that we're wanting to count and then how we count it. Whether it's trying to understand nutrition per hectare, or whether it's trying to understand the soil and how we're amending it. But we're going to have new measures of success, and then we're going to have to find the ways to count them.
What is the point of entry for that? In other words, you just identify that the new measures are critical. And I think that applies to a lot of changes that are needed on many different issues. The question is, what's the point of entry? How do you come up with a new measure and introduce it into the system? Because ultimately, what I think we are all very clear about here is that we're seeking change at a system level. So I'd be interested to hear from each of you, actually, what is your view about points of entry to effect change at the system level? We're trying to identify actions that we can all consider here as we move forward. And I'm very puzzled by this notion, and we've heard this morning about the importance of GDP and what happens when you focus obsessively on GDP and all the distortions that come with that. And I was interested in what you're saying about measures of productivity as being the mantra that every developer has. So how do you think about a new measure, and how do you introduce it so that you can have systemic impact?
Well, we're taking the approach that we start with the environment. What we do is let me start from a different perspective. Agriculture has become an incredibly abstract concept. I mean, you have a lot of people talking about agriculture that don't actually place agriculture as part of the food system. I mean, there's a whole lot of other parts of the food system. So you have to be careful what you're measuring in a system, because you can poke in one place and it feels good, but it's actually bothering another place. And so you have to look at it in a system fashion as opposed to just a static fashion. And so for us, we take the point of view of the smallholder farmer. Now, that's not the same that a politician would take. It's not the same that a corporate executive would take. It's not the same that the head of an NGO would necessarily take. The point of view is important. But we take it from the point of view of the smallholder farmer. We put them at the center of our work. And we say, what is it that's important to them? And so the measures that are important to us have to do with that smallholder farmer. Now, the smallholder farmer is usually a woman that has a life where it's not segmented, it's not siloed. I mean, she's living a life that's a hard life, that she's trying to get enough nutrition for her family, and if she's lucky, she'll produce a surplus. And it's got to be in a fashion that's not depleting her soil, and it's got to be in a fashion that's not depleting her water. So right there, we're looking at some measures, that soil, water, nutrients, nutrition, so forth, that are important. We have this project with Conservation International called Vital Signs. And it's our first effort at trying to actually understand what's happening with these other measures that are important to us. And we think that they're important to society as well.
And the idea, the assumption is that once you can introduce these new measures, you basically change the narrative and you basically change the parameters of success.
Well, the new narrative, and I'd be interested in Nick's perspective of this, but the new narrative, it can be global in some fashions, because there's some things that are points of disintermediation that are opportunities to affect it. So that makes a new narrative, but it's applied locally, and that's where you actually just need the principles. I was part of a World Bank study with Bob Watson that I referred to earlier, that tried to boil the ocean in studying agriculture. And it can get unwieldy and get out of hand. And what you're really looking for, what are the principles that are important, for today and for the future? And that's the part of the new narrative that then is applicable.
Would you like to comment on that?
I think the question of point of entry is a good one, and as you and Sam were speaking, I would point to two. One is information. If you think of information on refrigerators, it really does have an influence on what refrigerator you buy, and if you require very clear and strong information on that refrigerator, it can affect behavior. So one point of entry is what kind of information you require. Now, some things are going to work better in rich countries with supermarkets, and other things are going to work better in different places. But increasingly, you're going to be able to look at something in a supermarket and find out where it was made, under what conditions it was made. And if that information is either required or becomes a margin of competition, or with a bit of luck, both, then it seems to me that you've got one point of entry. It becomes, then the supermarkets have an incentive to make their stuff at least look cleaner, and with a bit of luck, be cleaner and safer, and treating the producers better, and so on. So the information story, I think, is very important. And how that's organized is something that I think research institutes working with retailers, working with producers, and working with places in developing countries where food is produced, that's a kind of collaboration which could be quite productive. What information would you want people to have, and how easy? If you can just take your mobile phone and look at the label and find out where in Costa Rica that was made and what conditions. We can't be very far away from that, and we know there are experiments already. So one would be information, and the other I think would be water management. And going back to, I keep going back to the village in UP where I've been working for 40 years, and when we first went there, the water table was perhaps only 12 feet, and now it's about 40. Now, we could tell stories of places, and Pavan could tell stories of places in South India where it's not 12 feet going to 40 feet, it's 100 feet going to 400 feet. But the water table is a big issue, and of course, the deeper the water table, the more energy you use. So I think water management in agriculture, which is, after all, in most countries, by far the biggest user of water, is something that matters on the whole conservation, environmental, regional scale, as well as very directly to the small farmer. One thing that's happening in Palanpur now, which would have been unthinkable 40 years ago, is that water's going into the houses. And in the last 3 years, there are about 15 of the 200 houses that got toilets. Now, you've got now water management in the village becoming as interesting to the families as it is in the fields. So it seems to me that there's a subject where local initiative, public investment, but a community managing their own water can make a big difference to how people cooperate, and of course a big difference to the productivity in agriculture in the broader sense that Sam rightly insists on, and of course their lives in a very direct way. So I would point to those two things: one, information, and the other, water management. I mean, you can develop both of those, but they do seem to me to be entry points.
Great. So we have metrics, we have information, we have water management. From your point of view, Peter, what would be a good, cost-effective point of entry that could help you get systemic change in the food system?
I am very skeptical about global systemic change. I think that we have seen the challenge of global agreements dealing with the crisis we're addressing in terms of just carbon, CO2. And I think that the lesson to be learned from that is that change is driven by enlightened self-interest. And the enlightened self-interest has to be what a family feels, their security. And I think that gets down to pretty local, maybe regional. And so I think, first of all, the point of entry has to be understanding that. There's a big difference, for example, between CO2 and water. CO2, you can talk about a global system. On water, you're talking about a watershed. You're talking about a water table, an aquifer, and you really need to. And I think at a family level, at a food production level, you're really thinking about that. If we think about global food production, we are fooling ourselves because we have never perfected delivery. We have never perfected equitable sharing. We come up with global systems that are driven by capital, by market, by kind of a global operation. And so I really, number one, I think the point of entry needs to be metrics that are really appropriate for community. And it might be a nation, a small nation, but if you get a complex nation, it's not going to be for a complex nation. So at a state level, let's say. And I think when you get to that place, looking at it from a state level, it needs to be culturally relevant and acceptable. And it needs to be ecologically real and acceptable. It needs to be, you need to be able to understand the way ecosystems operate, what they produce, what's a sustainable production as opposed to an unsustainable production. and I think that's and kind of going back to something that Sam said, one of the things that happened in our at CI when we went through this process of transformation was, instead of the initial measurement being kind of the biodiversity component, we flipped it upside down and said that the ultimate measurement of our success has got to be that the community is better off, that issues of health, issues of food, issues of fresh water, issues of protection from storm need to be addressed, and wealth, livelihood. The next measurement became, how are those affected by the services that nature provides and the flow and output? And the final measurement was, how do you secure the health of that foundation of an ecosystem? And that was very different for us. We had never looked at life that way. And I have to tell you that the hardest thing for us in our own transformation was coming up with the metrics. I did not realize how difficult that was going to be. I thought, well, it's going to be obvious, just, you know, happiness, wealth, it will all be done. We'll figure it out quickly. It took 3 years. Now we have a pretty good scorecard, and we have a dashboard that we apply, you know, to every engagement that we're involved with. Talk to Sam about, you know, how this relates to what they're trying to do. The metrics are really, really difficult, and I think that we need I found that we often overlook that.
Can I give another point of entry? And I'm sorry for harping back to this one village, but one thing we're all agreeing on is how local politics can be. And one of the problems in Palanpur, this is in Moradabad district in UP, has been monkeys. And some villages were dumping their monkeys in Palanpur, and of course monkeys breed like monkeys, and you can't kill monkeys, so you've got a monkey problem. And monkeys, as well as stealing your laundry, monkeys eat everything. And you know, it was really blanking out a whole range of vegetables, ground nuts. You just couldn't do it because the monkeys would get there before you. And so you got a problem. Now, you can actually, obviously killing monkeys is completely out of the question. So well, there is a system, and we've tried very hard working in that village not to be particularly helpful. Sometimes it comes naturally, but you know, because you know, we're social scientists trying to understand change in that place. But we did, at least the members of the research group said that actually you can call in the local block, and they will take the monkeys and dump them in a forest somewhere where the monkeys, we assume, would be blissfully happy. But you have to pay. Right? The village has got to put the money together. So they did. I mean, it was a big problem. So they did. But then, of course, once you start, it worked. And once you start collaborating successfully on one thing, actually you start collaborating on other things. The teachers didn't show up to school. Actually, they still don't show up to school very well, but there's a bit more social pressure coming in on that. The village roads, and it were filthy in a way that was a real health hazard, and they got together and started to make those better. So one entry is sometimes collaboration on one thing, and then it can lead to collaboration on other things, which in this case are just a village of 1,400 people. It's quite small scale, but that's another way. Is Rosie still here? Rosie Boycott? Yeah, Rosie, I mean, you've seen the way in which one sort of collaboration can feed and grow, and people start to see actually working together makes an awful lot of sense. So I think that's collaborate first on one thing.
You're I assume that you are talking about collaboration in a community like your example, but
Yes.
also at other levels.
Well, Peter was speculating directly on how far up that goes. It goes a fair way up, and I don't know how. Peter, you want to come back on how far up, how big units can be?
Well, I think that you know, I'm always I've spent my whole life being naively optimistic, and I will continue to do that. So, but I think that the lesson that we learned from the conversations at the UN about climate are that the most powerful driving force of every nation is our own enlightened self-interest. It's the same thing for every company. It's the same thing for you know, every community. So the challenge becomes, how do you make cooperation a shared enlightened self-interest? And what we saw with the discussions about climate was we failed in doing that at the UN level, because there are some countries that actually thought that it was not in their enlightened self-interest to join the conversation. So I don't think there's a particular level. I think that the higher you go, the more challenging it gets to get people to really buy into that. I think that, so at the community level or the family level, it's much easier. The most important development that I think has taken place that gives me enormous optimism is social media. Because social media has the power of immediately shining the spotlight on behavior that is predatory, on behavior that is not in the interest of a larger community. And that really is creating an incentive for many institutions who historically have not engaged in thinking about well-being of a larger community to actually start participating, whether it's a corporate community or whether it's a government that is concerned about its standing. I mean, we see that obviously in the news today, just in the Ukraine, but we've seen it play out in so many different places already.
Sam, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just.
And then we're going to open it up for
this issue of scale,
comments from the public.
of local to global. I mean, you got to remember our co-chair, his origins, have to do with big data and managing data. So to Bill Gates, it's an exciting challenge to have all this big data out there. Now, that seems kind of nerdy to a lot of people at a global level. But what he's really talking about is, how do you empower communities and individuals to innovate? And so the dissemination of information and the ability to get that to organizations, to farmers' organizations, to women's organizations, to communities, to get new information available so that they can do their own innovation is a very different world. And so that's a challenge that's in front of us, because farmers are some of the most innovative people that you could find if they have the information. So I think that's going to be very powerful.
Great. I see a lot of points in common. Pavan, your name was mentioned, and as we open up the discussion to the rest of the group here, I'd be interested in hearing from you your observations from this initial discussion.
Firstly, it's a privilege to be here and an honor to be invited to comment on such an eminent panel's thoughts, and also on the proceedings during the day. I've been in and out since an early flight. I'll just pick a few themes and try and summarize some of my impressions. One theme that keeps coming up in many different commentaries and many different ways is this whole idea of the narrative. The fact that I think this community seems to realize that we don't have the right narrative. I heard a comment this morning about 4 key things that we needed, and one of those was a new slogan, akin to abolish slavery. What would it be? What would the abolish slavery slogan equivalent be for sustainable agriculture? So again, that's part of the framing of the narrative. Sam, you did mention in passing, and not as much as you often do, the smallholder farmer, and I raised this point because to me, I think that is absolutely an essential element of what I suspect the new narrative is about. And you talked about the missing mill, which is also is relevant in that context. the challenge is, how do we at least create education about the older narrative? And I'm from India, and of course grew up in the days of what we then called the Green Revolution, with irony and sadness. I mean, it wasn't really green. It was basically about getting people to plant twice during the year, but mainly dumping lots of fertilizers and pesticides. And situations such as, well, if you don't have phosphatic fertilizers because they've run out in the shop, so you can't afford the others, just dump urea, because, you know, fertilizer is fertilizer. So you have excess nitrogen and not enough phosphate and potassium, and the results are there for generations to see. And literally for decades we've had significant problems of soil fertility losses and health problems and the destruction of the basic soil biodiversity, which is essential for soil health. So yeah, I come from where, yeah, we've got it wrong. But we can get it right. And I think Lord Stern mentioned this small example of system of rice intensification. I think when we talk about building new narratives, finding the stories to tell, I think many of you have raised this point about finding the new storyline. Finding success stories like the system of rice intensification can be quite powerful, and yet I don't think thus far we've done much on that. The SRI example from a small province called Nalanda district in Bihar came up at the end of 2011, and I still don't see that as having been built into a proper story as yet. This was basically 4 farmers in a small village there deciding to use sustainable farming techniques and essentially do SRI, which means not having 3 rounds of rice seeding and planting, but having 2 rounds and planting them wider apart and just using only sustainable methods and organic manure and less water and so on. And it has all of the benefits that Lord Stern mentioned, but even in India, we don't see this story broadcast. It's been published in The Observer, but I don't see it as part of the thinking of the Ministry of Agriculture. I don't see it as something that's coming out yet in mainstream media, other than the occasional little highlight in the media. So I think we sometimes as a community fail to spot the opportunities to convert our best stories into compelling, spreading, powerful messages. And I think, frankly, I think we have ourselves to blame in that regard. The 2 points that Nick, you raised in your response to where do we anchor this? Where do we anchor change? And you talked about disclosure and you talked about fresh water. I completely agree. These are really, really important points of entry, which I think we should try. And I hope that tomorrow in my session, those of you who are still there tomorrow will hear me talking about externalities and what that means and how that can be used as an anchor, as an entry point. And of course, fresh water is a huge connection. But Peter, your point about health, when you talked a lot about ecosystems and well-being and also the human health dimension. I mean, part of what communities get from ecosystems is of course to do with the overall benefits that ecosystems provide to agriculture in terms of nutrients, fresh water, stability, and so on. But part of what communities and towns and cities get also is improved human health as a result of not suffering some of the negative consequences of these so-called externalities of conventional intensive agriculture. And I think, once again, bringing this back into the narrative point, health is something that, just like calories, which are publicized and quite nicely disclosed, but other externalities are not. Certainly provenance is not, and it's quite easy to put the provenance of a product, and it's quite easy to put the expected lifetime of the product as well. We don't do any of that. In the case of food, we don't talk much about the health implications of that, as in how much is the content of the various chemicals which constitute those pesticides and fertilizers. I'd see that as an opportunity, and it's a combination of disclosure at the product level and using a very powerful human and emotive driver, which is the mother's need to ensure health for her child. Any families need to ensure healthy food coming into the household. I think these are powerful points of departure for effective action. So I'm delighted that I think they've all been captured and brought into the melting pot, Guillermo. So well done in bringing all of these ideas together. I think we are on a line of. I think we are on in this conference on a path of both creative problem solving and also discovery. And certainly, as someone who's not an expert by any means on agriculture, but someone with a lot of, with an increasing amount of perplexion about why we get this so badly wrong. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you once again for allowing me to make a few comments.
Thank you, Pavan, and we're going to hear more from Pavan tomorrow. All right, let's now start hearing comments, questions from the audience. I just want to see a show of hands of how many people have questions or comments to make so that I can figure out how to divide the time. Okay, so we're fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and take 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll work with that and then go for the next wave. All right, so we have microphones. Who's first? Bruce?
I'm Bruce Hirsch with the Heller Foundation in San Francisco. And I wanted to just for a minute shift the conversation from scale in space to scale in time, and ask Lord Stern if he could share with us some of his insights about the controversy related to the discount rate in the Stern Review, which critics thought unduly burdened the present generation in favor of future generations. And if, given that, he could give us some advice about the issue of including the cost of time in any analysis of agriculture and food systems.
Thanks, Bruce. Behind, yes, you.
Thank you. Tristram Stewart. As the author of the book on the global food waste scandal, obviously massively welcome Lord Stern's comments on food waste being a massive opportunity for reducing environmental impact and potentially increasing food availability where it's needed most when you're talking about waste in developing world farms. And, you know, the calculation that I made in my book, which is that 1/3 of the world's food is being wasted, you factor that into 30% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from food production. On the back of the envelope, something in the region of 10% of emissions just from food that is being wasted. And the fact that, you know, as you said, Lord Stern, the ability of this issue to appeal to the masses, we've seen a 20% reduction in food waste in domestic, in households in the UK. So it is a huge opportunity. What I wanted to ask you about is, you know, to what extent do you think, even with that 30% figure or in that region, how much are we massively underselling ourselves in terms of the true cost or the impact overall of food production? And the issue where I think we might be underselling ourselves most is on the issue of land use. Now, we've had this discussion a fair amount about, you know, what are the impacts and how you can measure them. But what about the opportunity cost? And take food waste as an example. I did a calculation in my book, it's totally hypothetical, but if you take 1/3 of the world's cultivable land, which you can assume is being used to grow food that no one eats, and theoretically you planted trees on it, that has, or according to 2008 emissions, which is when I did this calculation, the potential to offset 100% of emissions from fossil fuel combustion. Now, that's not a program of action being suggested, but it is an indication of the value of that land, both in terms of the environment, but also you could maybe use that land to grow food to feed people instead of filling rubbish bins. You could use that land for the allowance for de-intensification of other agricultural land. So that opportunity cost of using land in suboptimal ways it's obviously quite an abstract idea, and you mentioned quite rightly, we've got to talk about this in ways both that appeal to the masses, and I think we're getting better at that, but also that appeal to the economic decision makers. Is it possible to tell that story in a way that is credible to economic decision makers when it's very difficult to see through the reality that actually our choice to cultivate the earth, which has been the single biggest impact we've had on the planet, is actually one that is not non-negotiable. We can leave areas forested and we can afforest. And the REDD agreement, just to pick up on the failure of global climate negotiations, I would say, of course, it has been a failure, but the one thing that came out of Copenhagen is RED. And RED speaks directly to all of the issues we're talking about. It is the reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation does put a value for the first time on ecosystem services of our choices to do with land use. And should we be focusing on where we can pragmatically build from there to look at the true cost of agriculture and the potential to use land in different ways?
Thank you. I'm going to ask that people ask very specific questions and short so that we can make this moving a little bit faster because we don't have a lot of time. And so we're going to be sacrificing long discussions for shorter questions and answers. And I will leave it up to you to decide which of the questions that you're hearing you want to focus on more. So it's really your privilege. Yes?
In speaking about the solutions, I heard everyone talk about food systems, and I heard the importance of the small farmer. But then I heard a lot of talk about efficiency, and someone spoke about waste. And I think there is one type of good waste that we miss. We think about efficient systems, and in many ways, in third world countries, I think we need to be very inefficient. I think we need a very decentralized food system that isn't efficient because the number one concern, Jim Clifton, who is the CEO of the Gallup poll, just did a worldwide survey, and they say everyone wants a job. So the real solution of food, someone said it, has to be about putting people to work, and it's about small farms integrating it for the third world if it's going to be sustainable. If we build a large sustainable food system in the third world, it'll be great. You'll have less expensive food. No one will have the money to buy that food. We need to give people jobs. It's putting them back on the land. Small farms, sustainable, I believe. Does that make sense or no? Do we need more large food systems?
Nick, do you want to take a crack?
There's an awful lot there, of course. On discounting, I never use the language of the discount rate. It's immediately a conceptual mistake. Why? Because it varies over time and it varies over the good that you choose. So you're automatically, when you talk the language of the discount rate, nailing things down basically to one aggregate good, and you're often going away with some kind of constancy over time, both of which are wrong. But the discounting is about how you value something that comes now relative to something that's coming later. It can be a lot later, it can be quite soon, but it's valuing something now versus something later. There are two things that are absolutely key conceptually in that, both of which I think are not difficult to understand. One is, how well off are those people coming later going to be? And many of us, thinking about climate change, think that those who are coming later could be dramatically worse off than now. If you talk about moving to 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade relative to the 19th century, well, we haven't been at 3 degrees for 3 million years or more. 4 or 5, tens of millions, maybe 30 million. We've been around for 250,000. And really, our method of living comes from post the last ice age, during which we've been in a very narrow ±1, 1.5 degrees centigrade. We're talking about 100 years down the track, temperatures which are completely outside human experience. Not just a bit outside, way outside human experience. We don't know how the planet and we are going to interact with each other around that story. We could be walking not very far away into a situation where people are much worse off than now. So when you're talking about discounting, for that reason, you could be placing or should be placing in some outcomes, not in all of them, but outcomes that are relevant, higher weight on people who come later because there's a distinct reason to suppose that they might be, with a non-trivial might, they might be much worse off. The second thing is discrimination by date of birth. what's called in the jargon of economics pure time discounting. Do you attach a lower value to the life of somebody born in 2000? Do you attach a bigger value to that person's life than the life of somebody born in 2010? I phrased it so the answer is no. But I think if you look philosophically at the way in which we treat, I mean, go back to declarations of human rights, the Declaration of Independence and so on in the US, the notion of equality is the equality of a human being. And you talk about the circumstances in which you understand that equality. So take two human beings, by hypothesis, in exactly the same circumstances, except that one was born 10 years before the other. If you look through, and I've done this, and it's about to be published in Economics and Philosophy, it's on the website, the Grantham Institute at LSE. They're 2 long papers on equality, ethics, and the economics of climate change. But if you run through the basic philosophical systems which guide most of us, I mean, whether you go, from Kant to utilitarianism or wherever you look, essentially that notion of the equality of the human being runs through. So I can't see any decent philosophical reason for pure time discounting, for discriminating by date of birth. And I've argued that through in the best philosophy departments around. And it's remarkable how much support you get from that. And it's depressing how many economists just don't get it because they're used to a very mechanical view of the discount rate, which they just pull off from very simple models. So as I say, that you remember Groucho Marx saying, well, I can give you the long version and I can give you the short version. Why should I let you down so lightly? But if you want the really long version, you've got 2 long papers on Grantham Research Institute website. And we have to take those arguments out because it's confusion and mistake. And Bill Nordhaus has asked me to chair a meeting at the American Economic Association in January in Philadelphia on long-term discounting. So I'm starting to hope that economists will actually understand their own subject a bit better than they have done up to now. I don't know where to start with Tristram's questions on land use. I might leave that to others. I mean, land use is a fantastic, absolutely central. Using, for example, brown land in Indonesia to grow palm oil rather than putting palm on, cutting down, pristine forests to do it. The whole set of questions around, helping people to avoid slash and burn and use more sensible agricultural techniques. There's so much we can do on land use, which makes sense, and we just don't do enough of it. But perhaps I'll leave my colleagues to pick that up. Do we want more inefficiency so that people can have, quotes, jobs? I mean, no, is the answer to that. People want productive opportunities, and they're looking for how to make their lives more productive in the rich sense of productivity that I hope we're using here, well-being, sustainability, and so on. And the people have, and again, I'm going to be boring about Palanpur, but it's absolutely not unique in this respect. 25 years ago, 1/3 of the income came from agriculture. Sorry, 25 years, 2/3 of the income came from agriculture. It's now probably about 40%. And that's just in the 20. Why? Because they're going and integrating with the rest of the economy. A big part of their ability to do that is some extra capital intensity and mechanization in agriculture, which has released some of their own labor to get jobs and work outside. So I really don't celebrate inefficiency as sort of, quotes, job creation. What we should be celebrating is genuinely productive opportunities, how public investment, education, sustainable perspective on productivity, how that can generate. But there was so much there on land use that I'll pass over to my friends here.
Did you want to add on that or something else? Well, two things. On land use, I think that you're right. REDD was the positive outcome of the negotiations. And the success of REDD was the fact that it was understood, that there was an acknowledgement that deforestation contributed to CO2 emissions and that there were ways to address it. Clearly, there was not a global market, but there was a voluntary market. And the voluntary market is still alive and still thriving, and companies voluntarily are offsetting. And so there's a small flow of capital to address that, and maybe that will get larger if we get to a bigger marketplace. Land use is really fascinating because the way we have made decisions about land use has been extraordinarily unintelligent, right? We have put cities on the most productive farmlands. We have cleared the wrong forests, as Ian talked about earlier today. Just our strategy of where we're going to replant doesn't make any sense. So basically, when we look at land use, we actually have not thought about what were the ecosystems providing that we need. Instead, it was more of a spontaneous combustion. And so that is actually easy to improve upon. I mean, it takes thought, but we actually have the intellectual capacity to do that. And so I'm very encouraged by the fact that that conversation is taking place in many, many different universities and many centers all around the world. I think also there's another piece that needs to be emphasized, and that is, even though there wasn't a global agreement, there were regional level agreements. There are groups of nations that have come together and said, together we can actually address issues and we can actually demonstrate solutions. And the reason that is so significant is because those nations are being led by people that are more aware of the problems than their predecessors were. So you have the president of Botswana calling a meeting of heads of state in sub-Saharan Africa saying, let's look at the value that ecosystems provide to our people, and let's put that value on our balance sheet. Let's come up with what's the asset that we have that we want to secure, and how do we measure annually that it will improve. That's an agreement that 10 heads of state have signed in Gaborone about 2 years ago, and they are now tracking it, and they're working on it. So what that shows me is that we have kind of come around the corner in terms of leaders wanting to come up with solutions because they understand that the scale of the problems are real threats to the survival and the success, the stability of their own nations. That's a significant breakthrough. It's not limited to one group of 10 nations in Africa. It's a group of 15 nations in the Pacific that are saying, how do we manage our fisheries sustainably? Because everybody's taking whatever they want, and we can't stop them. We need some help. And so what we're seeing is not only that type of alliance, we're now seeing corporate leaders coming in and saying, it's in our self-interest to figure out how to collaborate and to work in a more effective way so we have a secure supply chain. And so what's really come together is a convergence of understanding and a recognition that we need to come up with some solutions that goes from the highest levels of government, looking at economics and their own survival, to corporations thinking about the same thing, to communities thinking about the same thing. So I actually think that we're in a very kind of high point in this conversation, and it's relevant to be having the discussion because there's more receptivity to the answers than ever before. The narrative is really important. We have to learn how to say these things in the ways that people will hear. And historically, we have not. And that's in itself a science. And we have to kind of get rid of our arrogance of saying things in the language that we want to speak because it hasn't worked. We have to learn how to say these things in the language that people will hear because that actually is what works.
Thank you. We are going to have to wrap up, but before we have one of...
Join with one thing,
Yes.
which is that the idea of inefficient systems just doesn't work. I mean, when you hear Lord Stern say 3 degrees and we don't know how people are going to interact, that joins to an issue that's an urgent issue as well, which is what's called the youth bulge. I mean, in Africa, an alarming portion of the population is below 25 years old. Those people need employment, or else they're going to go to big cities. And that urbanization is a critical issue. What's the philosophy? Are we going to have one large big city, mega city? We're going to try to feed that? Or are we going to have more regional cities, more local? What is it that we're going to try to feed? How are we going to try to have these people working? Off-farm rural employment is critical. And having a different scale is probably one of the answers. And so as Peter says, being conscious of the decisions we're making is going to be critical.
Great, thank you very much. So as we wrap up, I had asked Ken Wilson if he can give us his takeaways from this discussion. And with that, we were going to be wrapping up.
Yeah, takeaway is easier than summary because there was barely a wasted word this afternoon. That was really fascinating. He asked me for 3, but I'm going to give 2. The 2 are, one is about narrative and the other is about point of entry. I think what we've heard really clearly is that we need a new narrative, a clear, simple narrative, a narrative in the eyes of those we wish to act with it. I think we've heard that we're actually ready for this new narrative. We're ready for it in climate change. We're ready for it in the biodiversity conservation area. We're ready for it in terms of a new agriculture. We didn't really discuss it, but I think this meeting has shown we're also ready for it in the health and well-being field. So very exciting. Additional to the fact that we need this simple, big narrative, I think we've been very much reminded that poignant stories, even about monkeys, poignant stories can really ground this narrative and provide, if you like, very compelling memes that will bring people into it. So that's the first point, narrative, and I think that's really, really helpful for our plan. The second one, points of entry. This is what I heard. I heard that we have 2 methodological arenas, and they're clearly related, and they're sort of metrics and the public availability of levels of information that we've never had before. And that these are very powerful how tools, and the existence of these how tools can help us achieve some of the what tools or system change tools that we're after. Particularly in relation to the availability of masses of information, what's become clear is that if we can enable the curation of that information so that people can see the measures that are meaningful to them at the time when they're making those decisions, if we take again the simple fridge example, we can see that that's very, very, could be very effective. So those are 2 how tools, metrics and information. Clearly they need to be and can be related. Then we had these other entry points, and I thought we had some very strategic recognition here. Waste, water. Again, we didn't discuss it so overtly here, but health has been coming up a lot as a very, very clear entry point. These are very exciting areas. As you know, it's very hard to be against them, especially to say that you're against them. We had, I think, again, as we had around the first one, we had some very interesting nuancing of this. So these measures and these entry points, how do we do them on the spatial and temporal scales? If we move to slightly back to our usual discourse. How do we craft these on the scales upon which social action happens? And we need to recognize those scales, and sometimes they're very much associated to a landscape, if you like, or a watershed. Sometimes, as we heard a number of times, they're very related to cultural questions and to questions of the communities with the other parts of society with which people are prepared or able or enabled to cooperate. So I thought that those sets of points are incredibly valuable for us as we try to winnow down what are we going to do with this massive set of insights that we have represented in all of this work and turn them into system-changing activities.
that we're now wrapping up. We have to go for tea and then come back for the final session. So all that is left for me is to thank our panel very much for your time, your insights.